The views expressed in this video are solely those of the host and the guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of any organization or entity that may be affiliated with. We encourage the viewer to conduct their own research. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the PackBreakers, the show about tobacco harm reduction and the people of tobacco harm reduction. Today we have another very special guest, but before we get into introducing this guest, I want to just touch on what's been quite topical in this particular space for some time now, and that is the Tobacco Product and Electronic Delivery Control Bill, Systems Control Bill. And we are in the process of finalizing the public hearings. Now, our guest was somebody that I had seen at the very first hearing. Now, I didn't see him personally because I was unfortunately on another business commitment, but I was watching this particular submission at the hearing in Rustenburg in August of 2023. And whilst watching it, and I think I was watching it on YouTube, or maybe someone had sent a clip, but I know it was late in the afternoon, this particular submission gave me goosebumps. It was incredibly powerful stuff. And it was something that I felt needed to be thrashed out on the PackBreakers. So I reached out to Thembinkosi to share some of his insights and his journey around vaping. So before we introduce Thembinkosi, I'd like you just to watch this clip and see how powerful this is.
Good afternoon, Chair and honorable members. I'm going to try and be very brief. I think the previous speaker has probably canvassed all the issues, or at least most of the issues that I would have spoken about. But I think mine, is just to point out this bill is anti-Black. I'm saying this and I'm not a revolutionary. I'm saying this and I'm a consultant, and I'm saying this bill is anti-Black because if you look at the worst impact of this bill, it's Black people. If you look at who sells the most tobacco, it's Black mothers and fathers. It's Black youth in townships who sell the most tobacco. If you look at who works on tobacco farms, it's Black people, and they are the ones who stand to lose their jobs. If you look at the people who are in this whole area, that some of us in this room are telling their jobs don't matter, those are Black people. I have a serious problem when we sit here with people who are delivering key messages that are written by foreign foundations who stand here and tell us that we have to make a choice between health and jobs because the jobs don't matter. They keep telling us we should think only of health and not think about these jobs in a country with 32.6 unemployment. Where are these people going to find jobs? The people who sell cigarettes don't do so because they enjoy standing in the sun the whole day and touting for small monies. They do so because they need to keep their dignity. They don't want to steal. Tobacco is one of the easiest things they're able to sell. Now we want to criminalize them with this law. We want to give the police the power to harass Black people for trying to make a living. We want to tell Black people who live in townships in small yards where the houses are so close to each other, we want to tell them that if your neighbor smokes and the smoke goes over the fence and into your yard, you can call the cops on them because they're smoking too close to you in your own home. So everything we're doing with this law is to criminalize Black people. It's to victimize Black people. I'm saying, Chair, we need to be very careful. I'm saying there is every reason for this committee and for the Department of Health to want to regulate tobacco and vaping. Absolutely no one disagrees with this point, but let's look at what do we need to do and let's do it. Illicit trade is our problem in this country because you have such a huge portion of the market which falls outside the law and we do nothing about it. We want to chase the people who are fully compliant, who pay tax. When you raise the issue with the Department of Health, they say illicit trade is a matter for the SAPS. It can't be, because we are coming up with a policy that gives it fuel. We can't then throw our hands up in the air and say that's someone else's problem. It's their problem. This law must think about how do we deal with the issue of illicit trade, because it is actually giving rise to the issue that we are trying to solve. It's not someone else's problem. Let's solve it with the SAPS if we must, but we can't be silent and keep quiet about it. Francois spoke about all the kids we're standing here telling us about flavors, telling us all sorts of things about vaping. I want to tell you, Chair, I smoked since 1996. I quit smoking in May 2017 when I started vaping. I remember the last time I had a cigarette, it was 13 May, day before Mother's Day. I have not smoked a cigarette since. As of 2 weeks ago, I'm vaping nicotine-free vaping. I've run two comrades marathons. It's because of vaping. It is less harmful. No one is saying it is harmless. No, it is not. Yes, we have to protect young people. Let's do it. But let's come up with laws that actually make sense. Let's focus on young people. If someone sells a cigarette to someone under 18, send them to jail. Nothing wrong with that, but don't prevent me, the smoker, who needs information about smoking, from having access to that information. If anything, you should be encouraging me. You should be making it easy for me to find information about vaping, because guess what? It reduces the harm that I suffer. It reduces the cost to the public health system. But what are we doing? We have created this idea in South African minds that vaping is even more harmful than smoking. It's absolute nonsense. We should not allow a situation where people go around with propaganda coming from first world countries, coming here telling us that something is more dangerous for our health, when in fact, those very first world countries are using it to lessen the harm that their own people are exposed to. We should be promoting this thing. But at the same time, we should make sure that young people are prevented from doing it. But let's also be real. Nicotine users under 18 years of age, the vast majority of them smoke. They don't vape. They started smoking before vaping became an issue in this country. And guess what? They vape. So guess what? They smoke illicit tobacco, because they can get a cigarette for R1. You can't get a vape, at least for less than 120, not one that makes sense, at least. With the tax that has been introduced, it's become that much more expensive. And we want to focus our attention on this thing, and we want it to be so restrictive that we actually keep the people who can afford it, who need it, because we're protecting people who predominantly use the more harmful product. No one is saying let's not do something about it, but let us be sensible. Let us not be ideologues about it. Let us not be filled with propaganda. Let us not believe our own ideas. There is enough research out there. There are enough models out there that show us that it can be done better, that we can use science meaningfully in a way that supports the objective of what we want to achieve. And finally, Che, if we are serious about lowering the incidence of smoking in this country, when we put money behind it, the Department of Health does not run any quit clinics. The department does not provide any support for smokers who wish to quit. If you want to quit, their advice to you is deal with it. Do whatever you need to do. You have withdrawals, man up, deal with it. They're not providing support. They're not taking any active effort to say, how do we get people off nicotine? All they want to do is moralize and judge smokers, treating smokers as if smokers don't matter. With those few words, Chair, thank you.
So, a big warm welcome to Thembinkosi. Thembinkosi, I'm going to just say T. Good afternoon, good morning, sorry, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
Before we touch on that particular clip, can you give us some of your journey around smoking and then switching over to vaping?
Okay. Journey with smoking, I think as with most smokers, started quite early. The earliest I can recall is probably 96, at least smoking on a more permanent basis. I was doing standard 8 in those days. I don't know what grade that is.
Grade 10.
Grade 10, yes. I remember the days in the toilet and all the rest of it during school hours. So that was really when I picked up smoking and really, really enjoyed it. I'm not going to lie. It was one of the few things that I enjoyed. Alcohol, not so much, but smoking, certainly. And I smoked until 2017. is when I quit smoking. I mean, I tried a couple of times. I think the longest I'd gone without a cigarette before vaping was 3 months. And that would have been still in the high school days, but that never really worked out. But 2017, luckily, started doing some work in the tobacco vaping space. And I picked up what was then TWISP. I think it was the Cliero 2 in those days. I remember the last day I had a cigarette was 13 May. I think it was Mother's Day the next day. That was the last time I smoked a cigarette. And before then, I had been dual vaping smoking, I think, for about 3 months. And then I made the transition. And from the 14th of May, I think, never touched a cigarette since. And I still vape, and I absolutely enjoy it.
So, T, what was there an active, or based on what I'm hearing, there was an active reason for you to quit smoking? What was that?
Look, I mean, I don't know. Okay, first things first. I enjoy my addiction to nicotine. Let's start with that. And nicotine really is a difficult substance to part ways with. But also, I mean, I'm a father. I have 2 daughters, and I'm not really friendly with the idea of dying young or being sickly and all the rest of it. So as one started reading about vaping and, the potential harm reduction and the ability to quit smoking, or at least to replace smoking with another far more enjoyable nicotine product, it just seemed like a natural thing to do. So it wasn't so much an active fear of dying per se that motivated, but it just seemed far easier to switch to vaping, especially with the added benefit that I can do it in the house. I mean, I think that's a really convenient thing, because with smoking, you're constantly going outside and, trying to avoid the secondhand harm that comes with it. So there was the knowledge that it is far more harmful on the one hand, but there was also the element of convenience, that I could pretty much do it at any time, and I would not need to go through, the inconvenience of withdrawal symptoms. By the way, I mean, I'd also taken I think it's not Champix, Zyban.
Zyban, yeah.
At some point, I'd taken Zyban, and this thing was horrendous. I mean, I remember I used to sweat so much when I took it, and I think I took it for about 3 months. And the moment I stopped taking Zyban, I was back to smoking. And so I think the convenience of vaping and also the knowledge that ultimately I am doing far less harm to myself, I think it was while still meeting my need, for the habit. Because
Yes.
As I'm saying, I mean, I'm not one of these people who think that we shouldn't have any vices. I'm quite comfortable to have a vice, but I'm also comfortable to be in fairly good health, and maybe we'll get to it later. But I think I am in far better health now than I was when I smoked, though I wasn't sickly per se, at the time when I did smoke.
But let's just touch on that, because I now know that you've run the Comrades, and I believe it's 3 Comrades now.
Yes, sir.
So that's a remarkable story. I mean, would there be anything in your frame of reference, or even an idea or understanding whilst you were a smoker, to even challenge yourself to a Comrades?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I've been running since 2005, but more socially than anything. I picked up running when I couldn't afford gym after university, when the freebies, fell by the wayside. So I started running, but it was always, without even checking any metrics. Just go out, do 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, but not on a consistent basis. And after I quit smoking in 2017, I continued running. COVID came, 2020. And one of the things I actually realized, I mean, in 2017, before I quit smoking, I weighed 80 kilograms. And without a change in routine, except quitting smoking, by 2020, I weighed 94. kilograms. So I then got into the frame of mind that, okay, maybe I need to do something different, not realizing that it may have something to do with the fact that I was no longer poisoning myself as much as I used to with smoking. So I then got into a greater habit of running and it just seemed inevitable, because, the South African running community and talking up comrades. And I mean, it's a crazy idea.
Yeah.
But when you're surrounded by people, you end up doing crazy nonsense. So I ended up doing this thing. And it's 3 later. I can tell you, I mean, if I compare my running previously, even though it was not as intense at the time, could not be as intense, I suppose. I think that the runs are easier. I think the breathing is certainly far easier during a run. I mean, it's now possible. I mean, it's also related to fitness, I suppose. But I can't think of a time back then when I ran and was able to hold a conversation. Now I think I can run fairly fast, certainly by my standards, and be able to hold a conversation if I'm running with another person. So I am fairly certain that not smoking, I think, has been greatly beneficial for the running. I think the lungs have quite enjoyed, the transition.
So obviously, based on your experiences, you would disagree that, for example, vaping would introduce harm to the lungs in the same level as smoking would.
No, I mean, that's absolute nonsense.
Okay.
And I think it's the kind of nonsense that you hear from people who probably never smoked. The kind of people who come at this conversation filled with judgment. I think one of the doctors involved in the space says they are motivated by hate. And I wouldn't disagree, very much with that, because it is a nonsensical statement.
Yeah.
And it's a nonsensical statement not based on what science tells me, but purely because of what my body tells me.
What you feel.
Absolutely.
And what you experience. Now, let's talk about that submission. I mean, really powerful stuff. And there was a number of points that were touched there. I think by starting off saying that this bill is anti-black kind of shocks a number of people. And I think I'm safe to say, based on Dr. Jacobs' reaction after your submission, kind of shocked him too. And it provided me with a little bit more insights. I mean, I'm come from a sheltered environment. I don't know what those spaces are like. I can only hear about it and read about it. But when I heard that testimonial, it kind of rang true, particularly after me attending the Heidelberg hearings and sitting amongst people that were selling tobacco at taxi ranks or on the street corners, and how much umbrage they had taken towards this bill, that it's taking away their livelihoods. Do you want to delve a little bit into that statement and why you believe this bill is so impactful for a large part of South Africa's community?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think on the specific day, I mean, when you sit through those hearings, I pity anyone who has to, for a lot of them, because when you sit through those things, inevitably you are filled with anger, at the nonsense that people spew out from their positions of privilege. So if you look at the tobacco industry, yes, on the commercial side, that's predominantly big business, big farmers. But then if you come a few levels down, you look at who sells the most amount of tobacco, be it loose cigarettes, packs, whatever the case may be. These are small black informal traders. And if you go to any township, at any intersection, there's a guy there who's selling cigarettes. In the Eastern Cape, we call them maschai, because they are giving you a loose cigarette with a box of matches, to light up your cigarette and be on your way. Now, this bill comes along and tells us about tobacco being sold in prescribed packaging. And we know prescribed packaging means either a 10 or a 20, which means a large section of the smoking population, which is by design really, a large section of the smoking population, which happens to be black and in townships and rural areas will not be able to afford tobacco if it's sold in the prescribed packaging, because I mean a 20 of cigarettes I think is anything between 35 and upwards of 50 rands. So people are not going to be able to do this. So the largest number of people who smoke buy loose cigarettes. And they buy these loose cigarettes from people who are making ends meet. If you go to a taxi rank, you find people there with their small tables and their stalls. One of the products that moves the most is loose cigarettes. Some research done in 2016 by an organization called Sustainable Livelihoods, I think they found that on the daily, spaza shops and informal traders derive 70% of their revenue from selling tobacco products. Now comes this bill, which, as the doctor says, is filled with hate. And it absolutely does not consider the fact that you've got these people who are making a livelihood from this thing, not because they choose to wake up in the morning and go and stand in a corner, because they can't work in a factory, purely because this economy is the pits. It hasn't been creating jobs, it's losing jobs. I saw a terrible statistic the other day. Northwest has more people who are unemployed than who are employed. And what we expect these people to do, they have to sell something in order to be able to put food on the table. So that's the one element. And then you look at the farms who work on tobacco farms. It's poor Black people. We keep talking about developing the rural countryside, and we keep talking about agriculture being one of the areas that we need to put money into. Here you have a sector which could thrive, a sector that does employ people, and we are now actively introducing measures that are not only going to undermine that through the proliferation, or at least exacerbating illicit trade, which is already a huge problem in this market, but now we're going to create a situation where even more jobs are lost. So there's that element of being anti-Black on the one side. At a livelihoods level, but there's another level, I think, which is perhaps even more insidious, which is that if you look at who vapes, there's a class element to it, but there's also a race element. Black South Africans make up the largest population of this country. But if you had to look at the profile of who vapes in this country, they probably make up the smallest number of people who vape. I don't have the research to back that up, but that seems intuitive to me, given poverty dynamics, in this country. So the people who can least afford to buy vapes are Black. The people who smoke the most are Black. So we're creating these measures that are going to deprive people of information, right? Through all of these, bans on marketing, bans on communication, bans on, introducing smokers to vaping. And the biggest victims of this are going to be Black people who may not have access to some sources of information that are going to educate them about the potential benefits of quitting smoking in favor of vaping. Already we're creating, this misinformation and disinformation about vaping, and the people who are most susceptible to that kind of nonsense are Black people. So essentially what we're then saying is Black smokers who can't quit smoking, who may benefit from switching to vaping, because of the bill, because of the misinformation and the disinformation that we're putting into the market, will continue smoking, because they simply will not have access to this information. On the other side of this thing, you've got Treasury, imposing its own excise duties and, all kinds of things to put vaping outside of reach of people who are poor, essentially, ostensibly to protect, the youth. Fantastic idea. Except the people who stand to lose the most, are the poor Black people who, it must also be added, are the ones that use the public health system the most. So on the one side, you are trying to reduce the incidence of non-communicable diseases. On the other side, you are stopping people from accessing products that would actually, in the long term, reduce the incidence of non-communicable diseases and the burden on the public health system. So it's this unthinking way of doing things where we wake up in the morning and we decide we are going to regulate the WHO has said ABC, and the WHO, by the way, is not here. They don't understand what we're going through here. They don't understand the socioeconomic dynamics that we go through here. And unfortunately, our own government is so slavish in its thinking that it wants to adopt so-called best practice, from the WHO, come and superimpose it here. But the conditions on the ground are simply not at the level where you would need them, to propagate this kind of nonsense. Not that if you did it, it would work. It would still fail dismally, and you would still end up with a situation where more people smoke than vape, which means the burden on the public health system does not decrease. It actually increases over a period of time.
So it's effectively a nonsensical move on all counts, because if you consider that, based on the own World Health Organization statistics, 80% of people that smoke fall in the lower middle income groups in low middle income countries. And then we take in a product that has now been proven through the Cochrane reviews as being the most effective smoking cessation aid available out there. But now we're making it so unaffordable to the very same people that could benefit the most from it, to protect a group of individuals, and we need to be quite honest here, a group of youth who are in a high income bracket that can afford these products, and disadvantaging the individuals that are in the lower income groups that could really well benefit from it. So it's the cart in front of the horse scenario. It's really a rather nonsensical approach, purely based on an elitist and ideological view. I'd sometimes think it's not even an attack on smoking, it's an attack on an industry, without putting any thought into what are the ripple effects of this. I mean, you've touched on so many points there, we could probably spend hours dissecting it. So, can I say that you are against the bill?
You can say it any number of times you like.
Okay.
I'm absolutely against this. Maybe let me say, Kat, right? Because we've heard people in this hearing saying, "I reject the deal," right? Fantastic. I think most of us accept the intent of the bill, right? I think any sane thinking person wants to protect young people. Any sane person wants to reduce the level of addiction, right? This is clear. But where there's a huge gulf between the people who are anti this bill and the government, essentially, and its fellow travelers, is on the detail, right? I mean, just because something sounds fancy does not mean it's going to work. And I think the biggest problem with this bill, and it's been said over and over again, is no one has spent time to actually look at this thing and actually ask the question, is it going to work, right? I mean, your last remarks, one of the most interesting quotes referring to the anti-tobacco, lobby and what have you, especially when it comes to vaping. I don't know who said it, but they call them big tobacco's little helpers.
Yes.
Because that's essentially what they are. Everything they are doing against vaping ultimately benefits big tobacco,
Yes.
right? They hate vaping because big tobacco is in it. Well, guess what's going to sell? Tobacco. This misinformation about vaping, guess who wins?
Big
tobacco. So every last action you take against vaping ultimately benefits the dominant product in the market. So you stop channels for people to learn about vaping. Well, they don't need to be educated about smoking. They know everything they need to know about smoking, and they will smoke. So it's a really nonsensical situation, where the bright minds, because they're so slavish in their thinking, to WHO orthodoxy, haven't actually sat down and actually asked the question, okay, if we do this, how does it affect tobacco? I mean, one of the things we've been asking, and we asked the same question about the excise. So if you impose an excise duty of 20% on vaping, let's say, whatever number you can think of, how will that affect smoking? Does it reduce smoking? How much does it reduce vaping by? And what those people who vape less, what do they do to fill the gap? Do they stop vaping altogether, or do they continue being addicted to nicotine but use a cheaper and more harmful product, to plug the gap? And you don't get these answers. It's not because they're being arrogant, they don't want to give you these answers. It's simply because they haven't done the modeling. No one has actually sat down and said, okay, fine. If fewer people pick up vaping over the next however many years, this is how that is going to affect smoking, because everyone is just so fixated, on doing something about vaping. We need to be seen to be doing, being the worst of the lot.
But they can't even do the modeling because they actually haven't done any of the research.
Absolutely.
If we think about it, and I just think it's something that they seem to be wanting to do something, show that they are doing something, or it could be even more sinister, that there is some kind of deal that if they reach a certain target that they get X amount of funding, or if they do certain activities they get X amount of funding. There's no evidence of that, but that's the feeling I get, because you would introduce a bill into the country that has failed dismally in addressing the real situation, which is smoking, but actually with no research behind it. The last time they did a global youth tobacco survey was in 2011, and the first and only adult tobacco survey they conducted was in 2021. So how do you do modeling on such scant data? And they're introducing these measures where they haven't actually provided provided a mechanism to measure success or failure, to even provide any commentary or even any target to judge what failure and success is. So again, I agree with you that there's, how do you implement this bill? How do you enforce this bill? How do you know if the bill is achieving what you set out? And, what are you measuring it against?
I think one of the, and this may be a bit controversial and perhaps doesn't belong in a podcast about vaping, but talk about the 9 wasted years, they call them in the political space. Pre the 9 wasted years, one of the things, I used to work for government, so one of the things we used to say in government was, we may mess up a lot of things, but the one thing we know how to do is how to write policy for the conditions that exist in this country. And there was something called the Policy Coordination and Advisory Services in the presidency that used to take but the significant legislation. It would go through this thing, it would be reviewed, they would look at the impact, and then they would go back to the legislating department and say, you're smoking your socks? No, it's not going to work. Fix this, fix that. And then it would land in cabinet, and then it would, get into the system and then gets legislated. And whether or not it's implemented, that's a different story, but it's a good policy for what you have in this country. Now, come the 9 wasted years, the first thing the chief waster of these years does is to disband PCAS, Policy Coordination and Advisory Services. And all that policy making capacity, is diffused, within or distributed within the public sector. A lot of the old hands who had been there since 96 and had, designed the system of policy making for a democratic South Africa leave government, end up in a lot of these companies as corporate affairs directors and all sorts of well-paid people. And what you are then left with is a void within the public sector. And part of the reason why the system was built in this way, because governments pre-2009 had insisted that whatever else happens, South Africa will retain its sovereignty in the area of policy making. South Africa will not be influenced by grants. South Africa will not be influenced by investors. South Africa will make policies that make sense for South Africa. Come the chief waster in his 9 years, and you decimate policy making capacity within the public sector. Alongside that, you've got a declining economy, declining resources, and one of the areas that suffers greatly is policy making, funding for policy making, doing research and informing how policy is made. Now you've got a health department which is heavily reliant on donor funding for making policy, be it the Melinda, what's her name?
Bill and Melinda Foundation, yeah.
You've got Bloomberg on the other side. You've got Gates. There's a number of these foundations that are active, in funding health policy. And given the situation that we are in, in terms of our public finances, it's a good thing that at least there's some money coming into the system. But as the money comes into the system,
There's strings
it's
attached.
a give and take,
Yeah.
right? You take the money, but this is the kind of policy that we think would be suitable for this country. But an even more dangerous element of this thing is that you've got a bit of careerism, that's embedded in the system now, where people are working in the public health system, and while doing so, they are javelin throwing, because they're looking at what happens when I exit the public health system.
Where do I go?
Where do I go? And a lot of them end up with these foundations or
Revolving
the
door.
WHO,
The
right?
revolving door sort of.
Yes. So that's where we are. So you can't model things, because the people who are giving you the policy or the policy framework are telling you, we've modeled this thing is perfect, right? This thing is going to work. And then you go and look at the countries that pay for their own policy. They don't do this thing. They don't have it. I mean, you look at the UK, it's not doing this nonsense because they've paid to develop their own policy. They've paid experts to advise them on what is the best policy, to put in place. The US, with its craziness and all sorts of, problems around licensing of products and accrediting products, still is not taking money from anyone to design policy, right? This is whatever crazy policy they have is a homegrown crazy policy that they've said, this is the policy that we ought to have in our own country. The same goes for New Zealand and any number of countries in the EU and what have you. You may disagree with the policies, but ultimately, that's what taxpayers paid for, in their own countries. This is the money that they put in. But we are sitting in a situation where we get templates. We're sitting with templates, and when you put up a case of, say, the UK, and you say, "But why aren't you doing what the UK is doing?" Then they make us look crazy, and they say, "But why are you telling us about the UK? Why aren't you telling us about Kenya? Why aren't you telling us about Uganda?" They got the same template that you got from the same people that you got it from.
And in the same boat.
Right? So comparing you to Kenya or Uganda is comparing you against yourself.
Yeah.
We are comparing you against countries that have retained their policy sovereignty. We are not comparing you against countries that are in the same boat as you, that are either stooges or are on their way to being stooges in a way that we are currently as a country.
But if you take a helicopter view of this entire process, you can see it's replicated almost like cookie cut in all the lower middle income countries. And there is no breakaway from the norm. As we see, for example, in New Zealand, in Sweden. I mean, Sweden is absolutely phenomenal in terms of what they've been able to achieve in such a short period of time. New Zealand is actually even more phenomenal if you consider that since 2020, they've halved their smoking rate within 4 years.
Absolutely.
And they're now approaching that 5%. So where do we go now if you had to look into your crystal ball, if you have a crystal ball, where do you think this is going to? I know there's a lot of flux and there's a lot of dynamics that are happening at the moment, given the fact that there is the bill has now been sent back to NEDLAC for review, and I know that we have two hearings left, one in the Western Cape and the one in Free State. That's only happening next year sometime. And then where do you think this is going to?
Look, I mean, one of the... So May we went to, was it May when we voted?
Yes.
May we voted. And some of us who are in the space were making all sorts of fantastic predictions. And then we woke up one morning and we were faced with the prospect of a GNU. And we're like, God damn it. What are we going to do with this thing, right? And I mean, a GNU came into place. But more important than the GNU sitting, in cabinet in Pretoria making decisions is what has happened to the face of Parliament. Parliament is not what it was previously. And I think the ANC discovered this about 3 weeks ago, that it's no longer business as usual, with the establishment of a portfolio committee overseeing the presidency, where the ANC did not want this thing to go ahead. And it was put to a vote and they lost the vote. Now, from what we have seen, certainly with the portfolio committee of this 7th Parliament, the 6th Parliament portfolio committee, a bit wonky. But this portfolio committee, I think the opposition members in that, being the DA, Freedom Front Plus, African Transformation
lot more
Movement,
vocal.
Action SA, they've been a lot more vocal and probing, of the government, and of course the ANC MPs have seemed a bit adrift, once you start moving into a more technical conversation. So the first hope is that NEDLEC will come out with a report that actually reflects, more than just the government view of things, but a report that reflects partly the science and partly the economics, that are involved in this, because you can't divorce those two elements really. And hopefully when Parliament processes that report and starts looking into the bill, it will then ask the important questions, not simply that we can get it done, but after we've got it done, will it actually have the desired impact? And I think with the change in tone in the portfolio committee, I think we certainly, there is a greater chance that you are going to end up with legislation that reflects, to a large extent, I think, concerns from the vaping community on the one side, concerns from the vaping industry, and of course harm reduction experts. To what extent you're going to be able to bring all of that, all of that thinking into a bill, I don't know, because having listened to the Department of Health, these guys are stubborn. They really stubborn, and some of the things that they say, I think they should really be embarrassed to say these things as people who have been involved, in this space for such a long time. Whatever comes out of the portfolio committee ultimately is something that I think the National Assembly, which is a much bigger collection, because keep in mind that not every political party in the National Assembly is represented in the portfolio committee. So, for instance, ATM is an alternate member. They're not a voting member of the committee. So you've got all of these other political parties that will have to vote on the bill in the National Assembly itself, but are not necessarily participating in the conversations in the portfolio committee. So I think there's definitely more hope now that the complexion of the ultimate bill that gets voted on by the National Assembly will be very different from what was introduced to the committee last May by the Deputy Minister, who is coincidentally now the chairperson of the same portfolio committee.
Talk about conflict of interest, eh? T, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing some of your views and your insights around this. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for having me.
Thank you for watching another episode of the PackBreakers. If you enjoyed our content and learned something, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. You can follow PackBreakers on Rumble, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. You can also follow us on all our socials on Facebook and Instagram, VSML_SA. But all our information is saved neatly and concisely on our website, vsml.co.za. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Kurt Yoya from VSML. I have some exciting news to share about our podcast, The PackBreakers. We're shooting at an incredible location, The Shed in Silo. Check them out at www.theshedinSilo.co.za. Get ready for a visual treat. We'll be showcasing the stunning venue and state-of-the-art facilities offered by The Shed in Silo. From their spacious event spaces to the cozy cottages, this place has it all. Imagine a panoramic view, indulging in the farm-to-table cuisine at this restaurant. Fantastic cuisine. And relaxing with the refreshing drinks. Fantastic coffee. The Shed in Silo offers a truly unforgettable experience for anyone who appreciates nature, comfort, and style. So, mark your calendars and join us on the PackBreakers as we take you on a virtual tour of the Shed in Silo. Trust me, this place will leave you speechless. Stay tuned for more updates on our up-and-coming episodes at this extraordinary venue.